This morning. The clouds have cleared, the sun is out, and we're back for our 10th annual update to the nation on the High School Dropout Challenge. And I know you probably think, oh my God, 10th annual update. But it's actually, there's something comforting about seeing the same faces in the room, sticking with an issue literally over 20 years, because it's our view that transformational change actually takes 15 or 20 years and needs to cross political cycles and administrations. So we're thrilled to have you here. And Bob and I are going to give a quick overview. And then we'll have two extraordinary panels moderated by two extraordinary leaders that will give you an opportunity to engage and ask questions and be part of this discussion. But let me, because this has been such a long-standing effort, if the clicker will work, or Ellie, maybe you can move it to the next, there we are. Turning it on is always valuable. Thank you. I first want to give some thank yous. First to the Alliance for Excellent Education. Deb Delisle, she has a special place in my heart. I'm from Ohio. She was the Ohio chief, went on to be a senior official in the Department of Education with the Obama administration. Her whole team, including previously Governor Bob Wise, who I think did 50 of the 205 summits with America's Promise Alliance across the country. To promote action on this issue, and Phil Lovell and Monica and Jason for hosting us today and for the extraordinary partnership. Also, the America's Promise Alliance, which has been there since the very beginning. John Gompertz, Brother Gompertz, Monica, Dennis, Steph, Melissa, Grace, Maya, and the whole team who, under the leadership of Colin and Alma Powell, have really helped put this issue on the national map and been driving it over many years. I also want to thank the lead author of this year's report, our own Civic's Matt Atwell. Matt, where are you? Give Matt a round of applause. He deserves it. And Ellie and Aaron Ingram, who's in China, watching at 9:30 at night, the live stream. Hello, Aaron. Also, obviously, the extraordinary Bob Bolfance, Vaughn Burns, and Amanda from the Everyone Graduate Center at Johns Hopkins. Barb Duffield, Schoolhouse Connection, who's leading this effort with the group on Education Leads Home to bring this vulnerable population of homeless students to life in terms of boosting their life prospects. I have to take a moment to thank the lead sponsor and partner across 15 years now. Randall Stephenson, the CEO of AT&T, is deeply committed to education, improving educational outcomes in America. They wanted to make education a stronger data-driven enterprise. And so over the last 15 years, they've invested more than $500 million. And not just investment in communities all across America, but like mobilizing their workforce to connect young people with learning in classrooms that translate into jobs. And so that's Randall, that's Charlene Lake, that's Nicole Anderson, that's Kathy Fries, who's here today. That's Mylana Albright, who's just joined the team, Kellum Butts, Jessica Cameron, and so we wanted to do a shout out for them. And I actually think they deserve a huge round of applause for enabling much of this work we've been able to do across a large partnership. There's the extraordinary Chi Kim, who I met on the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development from Pure Edge. And because social and emotional development has been so critical to boosting outcomes in these previously low-performing schools that Bob and I've been looking at, like Tacoma and Fresno and Austin and Cleveland. That's been part of the secret sauce. They've joined this work, so I wanted to thank Chi. Also, Jeff and Tricia Rakes, Casey Truppen, Zoe Stem-Calderon, and Katie Hong at the Rakes Foundation, who are focusing like a laser on helping homeless students have better outcomes. And also the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We're so thrilled to have William Branham with us today. We see your face on the nightly news and the extraordinary programs you cover, William. But Pat Harrison, the CEO, Deb Sanchez, Stephanie Aronson. I was able to present to their board in February, and we showed that 89% of the American graduate communities actually had twice the rate of increase in high school graduation rates compared to the national average. So, of course, the board was thrilled that their investments show a strong correlation to increasing high school graduation rates. So we want to give, I also have to just, we're going to introduce him later, but do a shout out to the Honorable John B. King, Jr., what an extraordinary leader he's been for our nation, his U.S. Secretary of Education, now at the Education Trust, and we're just so thrilled to have you here as well, John. So quickly on our annual update, this has been a nearly 20-year effort, actually more than that when you look at the suite of Southern governors, Clinton, Bush, Hunt, others who made education reform in their states a really top priority. We've really tried to be, we tend to get in these fancy policy circles and we forget the connection between public policy and the reality on the ground. So we've been in hundreds of schools. We did a national sample of high school dropouts, followed by an America's Promise study on the same issue. Listened to teachers, parents, educators, superintendents all across the country. From the beginning, thanks to Bob's work in 2004 showing that 50% of the dropouts were found in just 15% of the schools, enabling sort of a classic engineering problem of getting the right supports to the right students at the scale and intensity required, we felt like this was a targeted, fixable problem and convened a large group to establish two goals. One, for high school graduation rates, the second on post-secondary attainment by 2025. We followed the evidence wherever it takes us, and sometimes it takes us in dark places, and we call that darkness out so that we can improve, and we want to persist at least through 2025 through our post-secondary attainment goal. We've made good progress as a country, variability among states, but challenges remain. Just quickly, we've had steady but slowing graduation rate gains. We're off pace to meet our national goal. But the good news is an increase from 71% in 2001 on the average freshman graduation rate, best available data at the time, and up to about 84.6% today, which means more than 3.5 million students have graduated from high school over that period rather than dropping out, which is actually a conservative estimate. Some other good news is the populations that are driving gains, thanks to the disaggregated data we have. Hispanic students have now hit the 80% threshold. That's up from 71% in 2011. Why 2011? That was the year we had the common calculation of graduation rates. Black students have made the most significant gains since 2011, but are still too low at 77.8. Low-income students are up to 78.3, again up from 70%, and students with disabilities have made significant gains. But what's more interesting, we think, than the national story is the state-level story, and we provide state data and are working with 29 state teams on the integration of social, emotional, and academic development. Bob's working deeply in 7 states with on these school improvement plans for low-performing schools. And of course, John King is working all over the country with such wonderful innovation and work, as many of you are as well. So what's actually new this year, in addition to all the data we provide, particularly at the state level and the national level, what's kind of, I think, new and compelling in this report that merits attention, and we were thrilled the Washington Post ran an op-ed yesterday that sort of kind of led, shared some of these findings, but thanks to people like Barb Duffield, who worked so hard to get homeless students as a disaggregated subgroup in the Every Student Succeeds Act, both achievement and graduation rates. We now actually have measures of the homeless student graduation rates, which can focus the nation's eye like a laser on improvement. Secondary and School Improvement Index, which Bob will talk about, these compelling indicators of what do you need to do in high school to actually have a better prospect of succeeding in post-secondary education. And then people like Stanley Littell, who in just a few years has rocked the country with P-TECH and these innovative innovations in the school-to-work pipeline. So very quickly, graduation rates of homeless students, they appear to have the lowest graduation rates in the nation. The National Center for Homeless Education has put out 64%, which is below any other subgroup. There are 1.3 million homeless students K-12 and about 360,000, which is an undercount because of all the stigma and fear around self-identification. And we also report for the first time the graduation rates of 26 states of homeless students. Minnesota, I think it is at 45.4%. Is that right, Matt? And I think it's Delaware, your home state, is at 81.3%. So over to Bob.
Thanks. We have so much good stuff this year, it takes 2 of us to go through it. So just a couple of more highlights. So one thing that's happened, right, we've had this really good improvement, right? Grad rates are up, and the number of classically defined low grad rate high schools, once upon a time called dropout factories, has gone down. But with that shift, like, it's a new environment. We have to understand that environment to keep the gains going. So one thing that's happened is the number of schools with 90% graduation rates or higher has gone up quite a bit. So that's a fantastic thing. And the number of traditional high schools, as we define them with like 300 or more students, which was our classical definition of a high school that we tracked, that's fallen from 2,000 low grad rate high schools to about 700. And those were really where targeted efforts happened, and over time they made a real difference. But one thing that's happened is because of the success in a way, the places that are still left behind, for lack of a better word, that have not made that improvement, they're actually in more dire straits than some of the schools that we initially were concerned about. So if you divide if you look at just the schools that are below 67%, which is the new ESSA definition of a low grad rate high school, the average grad rate in that remaining set of schools, which is, is 2,400 and change, is 40%. Think about that. In this day and age, right, when there is absolutely no work for yourself and no work to support a family if you don't have a high school degree in something else, and this remaining set of struggling high schools, not even half the kids are graduating, right? So what's actually happened then is the gap between the more successful and less successful schools has actually gotten better as we've been successful in an odd turn of events. And that really tells us why we have to double down on those remaining schools. And one thing that's interesting, or not interesting, but it helps us like reformulate our efforts, is among those 2,000 or so 2,400 remaining schools, as I said, only about 700 are the classical dropout factories we first put emphasis on, which was a regular high school with 300 or more students. Another chunk of them are high schools with less than 300 students, but more than 100, so quite small high schools. And a huge chunk of them, over 700, are alternative schools, which have actually grown over time, right? And there's good alternative schools and not so good alternative schools. And that's the thing we have to sort of keep our eye on, because that is one, in some places, to relieve some of the pressures from increasing grad rates. You could see a growth of alternative schools. So we have to figure out what are good strategies for those locales to keep our progress going. Under ESSA, if you're below 67%, you're supposed to be identified for comprehensive evidence-based reforms. The good news is that basically almost all of these high schools, in fact, have been identified under ESSA. So that sort of at least identification function of ESSA has worked. The challenge we have to keep our eye upon is that I don't think anybody anticipated 2,400 high schools coming in year one under that definition. And I don't think they anticipated, of that 2,400, that about 700 would be alternative schools, and across that, over 500 would be charter schools, right, which has sometimes different dynamics of reformed based on how their governance structure runs and how they're situated as their own LEA or not, which presents a different set of challenges. So basically, there's a new set of challenges to go the final distance, and we have to sort of reformulate our thinking a little bit from where our prior strategies were quite successful to go after the remaining challenges, which are still in some situations quite dire for kids. The next thing we look at, because we all agree now that high school graduation is not enough, and that kids really have to graduate prepared for post-secondary training, schooling, something beyond high school. Now it's a jumping off point for all, and as it used to be an end point for many. So as we all know, as grad rates have gone up, there's been a lot of concern, much of it quite valid, that are these rates legitimate? Are they real? Are undergraduate accountability, or people just giving diplomas away? I want to give a shout out to Dan Princiati, who's in the room. Some of you may know Dan went way back to NGA days in the early 00s. There he is. Dan recently completed a big dissertation study, his PhD, where he made a really definitive account that showed grad rate accountability made a real difference in the early year of grad rates. That states that had stronger accountability systems early on, or more quickly adopted the federal system, saw bigger gains. So we actually have clear proof that grad rate accountability mattered and made a difference. But there's also this pushback sometimes that if you make something accountable, people want to find a way to fudge it. So we all know there's been a lot of think about, is these grad rates real? So we did a lot of thinking about, well, if that's true, what kind of evidence would we see? Let's make the case that people are now giving diplomas away, there's no more standards, they don't mean anything. If that were true, what might we see? And what we said, if that were true, you would find states where grad rates are going up, but no other measure of secondary school achievement was going up, right? Any other measure would be flat or down, and if grad rates are up, that might be a red flag. So we looked for what's the available data we could look at a state level to test this. And we basically found what's available. So you can look at 8th grade proficiency on NAEP for reading and for math. And the argument there is that's a measure of are we increasing the number of kids going into high school on the path to college readiness. Because if you're proficient in math and reading in 8th grade, that sort of puts you on the trajectory to be college ready after high school. We also said, what evidence is that the kids are doing college level work well in high school? And that really we can get from sort of the AP tests. What are the AP scores of graduates, right? If more kids are graduating, but it doesn't mean anything, you would think maybe AP scores would go down, or the percent of graduates getting a high score would go down. And then we had grad rates. And what we found, we thought, was by and large good news, which is we found that in at least 2/3 of the states, grad rates went up, and at least 2 other measures of secondary school achievement went up. But we also found some evidence for the worry, because in 1/3 of the states, that wasn't the case. Their grad rates went up, and only 1 measure of achievement went up. But on the other hand, on the more positive way, there was only 2 states that were really red flag status, where their grad rates have gone up, but their other measures of secondary achievement have gone down. And those tended to be actually very small population states. And among the states that have actually done very well, that have seen improvement in grad rates in all measures of secondary achievement. Their NAEP scores are up in 8th grade in reading and math, and their AP, percent of graduates getting an AP score, were included Florida and California, right? 2 of the most populous states, 2 states that took very different paths to educational reform, right? Interesting, like not one way. And a high percentage of the nation's Latino students, for example, are found in those states, right? So that was an underlying thing that of those that are doing better are the more populous states. Some that are struggling, really important to get on it, but they're less populous, which pushes against the argument that most new diplomas aren't worth it. At least that's our interpretation. You can we'll argue that out later. And then the final thing we looked at was some other research we were doing is, we had these early warning indicators, been a very, very powerful part of the high school graduation rate increase. Being able to identify that as early as 6th grade, kids are identifying by their attendance, their behavior, their course performance, that absent intervention, they're off track. And that's helped galvanize a lot of schools and districts have a very focused effort on things that mattered, essentially enabling kids to be successful in school, right? And if you're not successful in school, you're not really on the path to graduating. So what are the analogs for that for post-secondary? And this comes from a recent study we did in Boston. And so it's, any study is limited to its locale. So there could be some interesting defining characteristics about Boston. But at the time this was done, Boston had a district-wide graduation rate of 62%, right? So it wasn't a high graduation rate district. And what we found is that the 4 things that said you were really on track to getting a college degree, a BA, was if you were coming to school at least 94% of the time throughout all of high school, if you had a GPA of at least 2.7 or higher, if you took the sequence of courses necessary to qualify for the state university system, and if you at least took an AP class. In fact, you didn't even have to pass it, you just had to take it. And what that all came to was essentially, you have to sort of do okay in challenging courses. If you do okay in challenging courses, students had all 4 of those outcomes, 80% of them got BAs within 7 years. Students that had none, if you had none of those, and 40% of the graduating class, by the way, had none of them, so that shows there is a lot of work to be done, only 10% of those kids got a BA. So that's even a greater swing than we found for high school graduation rates. From going from none of these indicators to all of them, your odds swung from 10% to 80%. So again, it just tells us that some of the things we need to do are quite straightforward, which is we have to help kids be able to get decent grades in challenging classes. Is like the most fundamental thing to say we're increasing the level of kids that are sort of ready to succeed in post-secondary. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bridge to bring us home.
What I love about that is that, remember how powerful the early warning systems were in terms of predictive power, and then also schools would use them. I remember being in Shelbyville, Indiana, visited it 6 times because we were guilty. A report we had written had put them on the cover of Time magazine as the poster school for Dropout Nation. And so when I went out to Shelbyville, they had a graduation rate of 70%, and 6 years later, they had put in place an early warning system. The whole team was meeting weekly about students and where they were in terms of these on-track or off-track indicators. And calling David Adams last year, they have a high school graduation rate of 94%, and one of the best alternative schools in the country I've ever seen. So I think these early warning or on-track indicators for post-secondary success are really, really quite powerful. So the other thing that's encouraging is, we took this goal of a 90% high school graduation rate by 2020, the class of 2020, seriously. And at the time, those students were in the second grade when we launched this campaign. And the encouraging thing is that this is this problem can be, we can close this gap. It only takes less than 200,000, 2 football games at Ohio State University of attendees. Less than 1,000 more students need to graduate in 17 states. So this is something we can actually, and we're encouraging states to work on these gap closure plans. Our remaining worries, when we started this effort, 1.2 million young people were dropping out of high school every year. We're at 600,000 now. We worry about, and going to do a major study on the scope and quality of credit recovery, because credit recovery is in 89% of the schools. We actually want to compare that to what it was in 2001. Our guess is it was still pretty high, but we know very little about credit recovery. Capacity of states and districts, particularly these places where high schools are the pride of the community, and they've been totally left behind, in part because of economic collapse. And interestingly, where our national election was flipped in a lot of these areas of the country, so it has really significant stakes. Pathways from high school to college to work, which you'll hear about more on the panel. And I had to speak at an event on social mobility a couple weeks ago, and I talked to Joel Benenson, President Obama's pollster, and he said the emblems of the American dream, which were a home, car, and college education for your kids, used to be that, that positive, hopeful thing. And they're now the emblems of the American nightmare, where they're associated with crushing debt. And so if we don't do something about the student debt crisis, we know we're not going to have the success in getting more kids on to post-secondary education. In terms of what we've seen in hundreds of schools across the country, everywhere we go, we hear this phrase, the secret sauce of success: create an every student counts culture, from the superintendent down to the cafeteria workers, who are all working together to understand who these students are, what they want to be, and get good data on how they can be helped. Graduation rate accountability, Bob mentioned. How learning happens. We know that social emotional learning is a booster rocket to everything we already measure. And the scientific community is gathered to make that argument very compelling. Early warning systems, multiple clear paths from high school to post-secondary to work, including the changing nature of work and being mindful of what that means in terms of the social contract. And then this relentlessness of adults providing student supports at all levels. We do this and we stick with this because we really want to keep the nation, the states, and districts' attention on the high school dropout challenge and what's at stake. And I know some people are like, oh my God, they're back again. But we're actually working with this amazing network through America's Promise Alliance of people who are really focused on making a difference. So it's now my extraordinary pleasure to introduce one of my favorite people in Washington and the country, because he's both brilliant and humble, and it's just so rare to see somebody have that combination of gifts. He's also, has kind of a ground-up perspective. He was a middle school principal, a high school social studies teacher, went on to be state education commissioner in New York. And then, of course, the charismatic and really well-respected on both sides of the aisle, President Obama as Secretary of Education. He's now President and CEO of the Education Trust. He's also one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. And when I was in Chicago for a meeting with Castle with 29 state teams, this woman across the room gave one of the most articulate statements of what was at stake. And I turned to Bob Balfance and I said, "Who is that?" And she came up to me and she said, I'm John King's husband. And I now want to introduce John King as Melissa's husband. So welcomed into the stage.
Good morning, everybody. Well, it's always fun to get to hang out with some of my education heroes. So thank you, Bridge, for the introduction. Thank you, Bob, for your thoughtful opening. It's good to be here with folks like John Gompertz and Stanley Littell, who have been at this work for so long. And of course, good to be with my former Education Department colleague and friend, Deb Delisle. This morning, we're going to have a panel discussion. I want to get right to the discussion focused on homeless students. Just a couple remarks to frame how we think about this. It is, I think, an embarrassment to the country that more than 1/5 of the folks who experience homelessness are children. That is, I think, an indictment of where we are as a country, that we are the wealthiest country that has ever existed on the face of the earth, and yet We have young people who will sleep on the street tonight. The question about schools is that we know we have at least 1.36 million kids, probably many more, who are homeless. And the question for schools, what are we going to do to support those students? How do we help to ensure that those young people are successful? And I want to suggest as we enter this panel discussion that the answers have to be intersectional. That many of the young people who are homeless, it is as a result of intersectional forces in their life. It is issues around access to affordable housing. It is issues around access for parents to addiction treatment. It is issues around economic opportunity and access to transportation. It's issues like our juvenile justice system that responds to young people who've experienced trauma with incarceration. It is issues around discrimination against LGBTQ young people by the broader community and sometimes within their own family that causes them to become homeless. And so as we have this conversation, we have to think in an intersectional way, and we have to ask ourselves, what can we do collectively to address the needs of our homeless students so that they are successful? We must do that if we want to close these graduation rate gaps that we face. It's both encouraging the progress that we've made, but we also now have to confront the reality that in many of these schools, the schools that Bob described, these are schools that are serving large concentrations of homeless students, young people who are in foster care. They're often schools that are serving large numbers of English learners. Right? And so we can't get to our goal unless we figure out how to best support our most vulnerable students. So let me call up this extraordinary panel that we have. Of course, Barbara Duffield, who is a national leader on these issues and is executive director of Schoolhouse Connection. Barbara, come on up. We have, we could applaud for Barbara. Yeah. We have Kathy Scheffel, who is the McKinney-Vento Homeless Liaison and Foster Care Liaison for the Fairfax County Public Schools. And we have Elaine Williams, who is a Schoolhouse Connection Young Leader and, importantly, a 2017 graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University. All right. So let me start with you, Elaine, and let me ask you, we've talked already this morning about the 20-point graduation rate gap for homeless students compared to their stably housed peers. Can you talk about some of the obstacles that you face and that you see other young people facing on their path to high school graduation?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and your amazing remarks. I would say as a first-gen graduate, high school graduate, as well as a first-generation college graduate, some of the obstacles that I would like to discuss with you all today is external factors as well as internal factors. And so I love how you talked about trauma and the impact trauma has on individuals. And so as I went through my secondary education, trauma was a big factor in my life. And so trying to go to school and trying to do day-to-day tasks, such as do well in school, was really difficult when your mind is always in fight or flight mode. And some of those traumas came from external factors or historical trauma and the impact that systemic racism has on our communities of color. And so those factors were not as clear as I was going through secondary education. So the transient and being very mobile in my living situations and having to move place to place seemed like it was normal for me. And so I was used to having to move with family, but not understanding that the housing affordability was also impacted by the systemic racism and how people of color are treated in America. And so another thing I would say was the stigma around homelessness, right? And when we say homelessness, what we automatically goes to young people sleeping outside on the sidewalk or sleeping on a bench, and that's not every young person experience. And that wasn't my experience. It was going place to place every single night and having to worry about where the next meal would come from. But being in places, right, physical places I was staying in. And also, I would say the lack of awareness of services for youth experiencing homelessness and in my school system. And also, I want to highlight something about public school systems and the infrastructure that has been built to oppress Black children. And so that was another factor, that when you're going into an institution and you have so many other obstacles, such as dealing with housing instability and also being a person of color and going into a system that's preparing you for the prison system. And so having to have security guards check you and everything, and that trauma that's being put on Black children every single day, Black and brown children. And so that was another challenge I would say I faced personally. And then thinking about mental health and the impact mental health had on my family, the criminal justice system, and how many of my family members, particularly my birth mom, was in and out of the system due to trauma that was untreated and no one talked about what services were there for her. So I would say those are some barriers I faced while in high school.
Thanks so much, Elaine. Let me ask you, Kathy, you're in a school district in Fairfax County trying to respond to many of the challenges that Elaine just described. You've been collecting data on the performance of homeless students for some time. Can you talk about what you're doing in Fairfax County to address some of the things that Elaine described?
Sure. Is this working? I can talk a little bit about our program and how we support our homeless kids. We're a very large school division, so I run a district-wide program over 200 schools. And one of the things that we found is working for our group the most is having targeted support for students, particularly our high school kids, and for post-high school planning. So I have a staff member on my team that the entire school year she meets with seniors, and she's a teacher, she's a parent, she's a navigator, she helps them with all their financial aid applications. She works through all the logistics that seniors who are housed, and also, most of our unaccompanied youth who are seniors, she spends quite a bit of time with, just making sure that they do all the things that their housed peers with parents are able to do, staying on deadlines, looking for scholarships, all those things. So for this school year, we had some pretty amazing data. We had 153 homeless seniors, and 88 have confirmed plans to go to higher ed. So we feel like this targeted support works. And what that means for us is looking at, a little bit like what Elaine said, logistics and barriers that are individual to the student. So although we have a large number of homeless students, they're not really a group. They're individual kids with individual stories and individual barriers and logistics that may really have nothing to do with their homelessness, but are impacting their ability to access education. So we look to our community partners. Is it a housing issue? Is there a health issue? Is there a mental health issue? Does the student need to get to a dentist? Is there basic needs that are bothering the student's ability to function, to get to school or go to school? A lot of times we find out that our students with attendance problems, it's not that they don't want to go to school, they have to work. And so it's a job conflict. It has, they're very committed to their educations. They just had to choose that day if they were going to go to work to help their family or go to school. So we work with all our alternative programs. Like it was mentioned before, some of our alternative education is very, very helpful to our homeless students who need a different kind of schedule so that they can graduate and go on to higher ed. We also do a lot with our community to increase awareness. So our community partners are helping our program. They're helping us with donations of things that we can't use education money for. So lots of basic needs, lots of just things that kids need to stay on the same playing field as their peers that have other resources. So we do a lot of working with our community partners and private scholarships within our community itself. Our faith community is very active with our program. And they spend time asking us, what do you guys need? And a lot of them have just given us their name and said, call us if you need something for a student, and we do. And we call and say, we have a student that needs to go to visit a college. Would you be willing to help? And they almost always say yes.
Thanks, Kathy. Barbara, let me ask you, you've been a champion of making sure that data are transparent about homeless students. Talk about why data are important and how data can help support folks like Kathy and also ultimately help students like Elaine be successful.
Sure. So in the early days of focusing on homelessness as an education issue, we were really focused on access. You can't go to school if you don't have a residence. A lot of the rules that make sense for students who have permanent stable housing will get in the road. So we knew at that time that more than half of all children who were identified as homeless weren't even going to school. So that marker of that low number of even being enrolled in school sort of set us on the path of advocacy to remove barriers to education. Now that we have, and we can't assume, of course, that just because there's a law that says you should not have an enrollment barrier, that it's not still there. And in fact, the report that Civic did, Hidden in Plain Sight, 67% of the young people who were interviewed said that residency requirements were still a barrier 30 years later. So that's a challenge. But now that we have graduation rates, a spotlight shining on not just access, but success, now we can do something about that. And I think one of the things that struck me about the presentation of today's data was just the gap that we see between the graduation rates of students who are experiencing homelessness and those who are poor but housed, low-income students. That's 14% difference, which shows us that there's an impact of homelessness over and above living in poverty. And a lot of that educational impact has to do with what Elaine talked about, the trauma. So there's the trauma of why you're experiencing homelessness, and then there's the trauma of what you experience and the barriers when you are actually in a homeless situation. We also know from data and research, including from Education Trust New York, that the impact of homelessness on achievement can last. So housing isn't the cure-all necessarily. It doesn't necessarily fix things right away. And that there was a lag. Students who were formerly homeless were performing at similarly poor rates on academic assessments as currently. So we know that tells us that we need to look at this as a marker and go during, before, and after the experience of homelessness. And one other piece about data I'll say too is that we now have new research that highlights the salience of high school graduation in the overall effort to address homelessness. We now know that a youth without a high school diploma or a GED is 4.5 times more likely or as likely to experience homelessness as a young adult. That was the highest of any risk factor studied, even when controlling for other factors. So that makes education an incredibly strong protective factor in getting out of homelessness. And again, now that we have the data, what can individual districts do? They can actually measure their progress. So for example, we know that there are districts that are doing very, very great work in focusing on students who are homeless. Fairfax County is one. There's a district in Texas, Deer Park, where they graduated 100% of their homeless seniors, but the next year it was different. Why? They looked at that data. Who were the students who didn't make it to the finish line? They were teen parents. So they knew they had to go in because while adolescent pregnancy has dropped generally for the nation, that's not true for students who are experiencing homelessness. So that told them what to look at. So I guess just generally, I would say homelessness is an education issue. It represents many systemic failures in society, but these children and these youth who are homeless are in our classrooms today. There's an urgency and there's something we can do about it.
Thank you. Elaine, let me turn to you and ask you to talk about what were the supports that made a difference for you. We all are proud of your success, and we want to hear what helped you to get there.
Thank you. Is this on? No? Okay. All right, I'm back. So I would say, as you were asking that question, I started to think about a village. And I would say my village consisted of family and non-familial support. And I would believe that that was the most pivotal point to be able to be successful. It was in high school, my best friend and her mom believing in me as I was going through housing instability and saying that you have a home here and we're going to invest in that. It was my McKinney-Vento liaison social worker in high school that saw something in me and saw the desire for me to want to go to college and believed and invested in that. It was also my mentor who decided to walk alongside of me. And I love how Kathy talked about that individual one-to-one relationship being built and really investing in young people, because I think from a person who have lived experience with housing instability and homelessness, it's so vital to have someone consistently in your life as well as investing in you even in the hard times, and especially when there's trust that is broken and you fear that people are going to come in and out of your life consistently. And so having that village around me really was a pivotal point. I have 5 younger siblings, and seeing 4 younger siblings, and having them look up to me and see that because I was able to make it, anything they were dealing with in school or in their lives, they were able to overcome. And so I would say my village in particularly, and then also learning how to advocate for myself and the importance of using my voice to really advocate and get the needed resources that I needed to be successful and not being afraid to ask for help.
Thank you. Barbara, you're leading this effort around Education Leads Home, which is trying to scale some of what Elaine is describing. But the goals are really ambitious. What makes you hopeful that we'll be able to achieve the goals, particularly around graduation rates? And where are the bright spots that you're seeing around the country?
Well, the goals for Education Leads Home are high because we know the potential of every single child, and we believe they have the same potential if given the support. So we know that they're possible because we have our young leaders like Elaine and others who we see do it, and we have school districts that are taking action and initiative. So those bright spots let us know it's possible, and they also show us how it can be possible. So for example, one of the first things is to acknowledge that it's an issue. Homelessness is invisible. As Elaine said, young people are going from place to place to place. So what are some of the ways that schools are actually finding these students, talking to students about homelessness, making sure that all the staff know? That gives us hope. What are they doing to stabilize? Once you know a child or youth is experiencing homelessness, how can we minimize their disruptions? How can we build on existing systems like early warning systems? So again, we have hope because in Spokane, Washington, the homeless student graduation rate outpaces that of all students in the state. And they did that by using the early warning systems and honing in on homelessness, making that part of how they addressed it, or in Nashville, where they looked at chronic absenteeism and saw that the rates of students experiencing homelessness were twice that of other students. They said, why? Transportation, assigned a staff person to oversee transportation for homeless students. In 1 year, absences went down by 7% for students who are homeless. That gives us a lot of support. And lastly, we have a state partnerships project as part of Education Leads Home, where we have state-level leadership. We have governors who've endorsed these goals and have said, we're going to put some work behind this. And they've selected the piece that they want to sell, whether it's early childhood or whether it's K-12 or whether it's postsecondary. And they've put their commitment behind those goals. So we see at the local, state, and at the national level real commitment and real progress.
Excellent. Kathy, let me ask you, what additional supports do you need at the district level in order to better serve your homeless students or your housing insecure students?
More time in a day. I think for us, training is ongoing and necessary for anybody that has any interface with homeless students. And not the kind of training where you either show a quick PowerPoint and everybody goes out, but really talking and having discussions with school staff about kids, what kids might need, what homelessness might look like in our community, and it might look different in other communities. A little more time on that, spending more time with individual schools. We get out to almost all of our schools, but it's ongoing. You can do your training, and it's not like you can check it and say, okay, that's done, they're trained. It's ongoing discussion about our kids and having a flexible program so that the program is constantly changing to meet the needs of whatever's going on in the community. So at least annually having changes in the program to meet kids' needs. The other thing that I think we all need are funds that are not restricted, so that can be used for lots of things that kids need, not just school supplies or backpacks or things that you think students need, but maybe a student needs to get their eyes checked or get some help with a co-payment for a mental health appointment, something else. So unrestricted funding that somehow we can use on an as-needed basis for kids, I think would be helpful for us. Navigating college and post-high school. So once they get to college, we can't just say, great, have a good time, we're done. We need to have a handoff to the higher ed and make sure that we are still keeping relationships with our students, because the logistics that they encounter in college, it's good for them to be able to come back and say, can you help me figure this out?
And part of what Kathy raises is the importance of systems working together, collaborating effectively. During the Obama administration, we put out this toolkit, Healthy Students, Promising Futures, which was a joint effort by the Education Department and Health and Human Services to focus states and school districts on ways that health and education could collaborate, using the school enrollment process to make sure that students and families are enrolled in healthcare, whether that's Medicaid or through the exchanges, using Medicaid dollars to support school-based health centers to provide the kinds of health services that you're talking about, Kathy. We also pointed out that states could use Medicaid dollars for case management to help students and their families get access to things like housing or addiction treatment, so forth. What we worried about, and the reason we put out that toolkit, is too often folks aren't talking across systems. Barbara, can I ask you to talk a little bit about the foster care system and some of the reasons that we see foster youth overrepresented amongst the homeless population. And then can you also talk about the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system more broadly and the connection to homelessness?
Sure. Right now we have our scholarship students in town. We had a congressional briefing yesterday with our young people, and so if they're watching in their Airbnb, I'm listening to everything that they said, particularly about the child welfare system. There was one of the young leaders talked about why was it that every time CPS came to my house, they then left. And so we often look at the intersection between child welfare and homelessness as exiting out into homelessness. But Chapin Hall, again, put out a report last week. 44% of the young people they talked to identified the beginning of their homelessness as going into foster care. That's when they said their story began. So there are massive failures of the child welfare system that I don't have the answers to. I think young people have the answers to, and we need to be talking to them about that. But that interaction is definitely part of the mobility that we see. A school lens sees children and youth move in and out of homelessness. It also sees children move in and out of systems. And that is true for the juvenile justice system as well, where it's obviously the discharge planning is part of it, but all the other things, as Elaine mentioned, the trauma that doesn't get identified as trauma, and therefore young people are disciplined for it inappropriately, which leads to a whole cycle.
Elaine, talk about what you're doing, because you're an activist in the community trying to impact these issues. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I've had the honor to, from living and being able to go back into my community in Richmond, Virginia, to do work around youth homelessness and housing instability. And one thing that has came out that effort is Advocates for Richmond Youth, which is a participatory action research team that is working with the individuals who are deeply impacted by the issue, centering their voice and using research to really drive home how we want to see change in our communities. And so I've been a part of that effort since the inception, and seeing young people see their voice and their power and their story, and being able to share their story, and also speak truth to power and tell people in positions of power what they need to do to help us be successful or partner with us. And also, we've also built a coalition, the Youth Stability Coalition in Richmond, that's working with the intersectionalities of different sectors who come in contact with youth experience and homelessness, and really trying to work collectively to come up with a comprehensive plan that we have created to end youth homelessness in the city of Richmond, and thinking about the criminal justice system and the health system and all those systems that young people are coming in contact with, and also having a conversation, because we saw that there was a big disconnect between people having conversations. And I love how Kathy talked about it's not enough to tell me to go somewhere. I need some guidance to get there, to know that I'm going to get the needed resources and not just be seen as another number. So through that effort, I've been able to do community organizing, work with neighbors in the city of Richmond, and helping them see their capacity and building their capacity, and to exercise their agency to create change around issues that impact their community every single day. So I would say, in a nutshell, is really equipping individuals to see their agency, right? I believe we all have power. Some of us just been told that we don't have power. So once you've been, I don't want to say empowered, but given space to exercise that power, you see the change that you can create in your communities. And I'm able to I was on the receiving end, and now I'm on the other end, being able to empower other people to see their strength as well.
Great. Thank you. Kathy, let me ask you, when you're talking with principals and teachers, I'm sure folks feel overwhelmed. They have lots of challenges, and this may feel, better supporting their homeless students may feel like another big challenge that may be beyond their reach. How do you persuade people that they can make a difference?
I don't think they need to be persuaded as much as just a conversation about our community and what our kids might need, and the gifts that our kids are bringing to the school that they already know about, and just talking through what we can do that it's not always gigantic things that you have to do. Sometimes it's very, very simple things, getting to know the student, being flexible with what the student needs are, making sure that there is an adult in the building that's connected with that student. If there's any issues that come up, making sure that they know that they can call our office and say, we're worried about this student, we're not sure what to do. So they're not alone, and they don't feel the responsibility. It's not something we give to them as much as we are offering support and resources. And we get lots of calls from school administrators just calling to say, we're not quite sure what's going on with this family, can you help? And then we can get involved to see what the barriers are. And again, like we were talking, it's very individualized. Every family has a unique set of circumstances that we need to just take some time to find out what all's going on, and it may not be what it looks like. So attendance isn't always what it looks like, or if the parent's not being forthcoming with their address, it's not always what it looks like. There's probably something else, and just take some time with the family to build a relationship, and then we can come up with some solutions.
Kathy raises one particular challenge that we see in a lot of communities now, where families are reluctant to share information because of the context around immigration policy. Barbara, can you talk a little bit about how the current moment in immigration policy is affecting the ability of schools to meet students' needs?
Well, we know because one of the things Schoolhouse Connection does is we have a lot of contact every single day with McKinney-Vento liaisons and school staff who are seeking support for students. And so we definitely have heard from liaisons that families are afraid to disclose their situation because of fear of being reported, in some cases even leaving their homes, because of that fear. So it absolutely contributes to the challenges that schools have in terms of identifying young people and making sure they're connected to supports. It means that we need to be very sensitive in how we ask information. So for example, just to talk about identifying students, we used to say a best practice was to have a student residency questionnaire. Well, now the word residency has all sorts of connotations. So we changed that. We say it's a housing status questionnaire. So it's absolutely affected how we think about the issue and how schools respond.
Well, so we have a little bit of time for questions. So let me ask our audience for questions that they have for our panelists. Now, I was a high school social studies teacher, so I am not afraid to cold call. So if there are, so be ready. Yes.
Hi there. Thanks very much for being here. I'm Philip Lovell with the Alliance for Excellent Education. Oh, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Philip Lovell with the Alliance for Excellent Education. Could you talk a bit more about the intersection between substance abuse and homelessness and the ability of the school system to address that, or the inability of the school system to address that?
Substance abuse with the students or with the parents? Or just in general?
All of the above.
I'm not sure that I have data particularly on that, but I would say that within our school system, we have wonderful community resources and are able to get our kids and our parents connected to assistance for substance abuse very quickly and easily, particularly students, any mental health needs actually. For students, it's very simple for us to get our kids connected. We've had very few barriers, lots of good relationship building within our community mental health and with our school social workers and our school psychologists. I feel like we have that addressed with, at least within our community.
Three quick observations on this issue. I just was with Bill Frist, who was Senate Majority Leader, Dr. Bill Frist. We were talking about the intersection between health and education, and a few things that came up in our conversation. One is states that have participated in Medicaid expansion are able to provide health care services to parents that states that have opted not to participate in Medicaid expansion are not able to provide, including addiction treatment. And so there's a real advantage, we know, to having parents have access to addiction treatment to reduce the likelihood that families will end up in the kinds of crises that result when addiction is untreated. Two, we know that there are some communities where there are very few places that provide addiction treatment, and the lack of access to treatment then compounds other challenges. So I think about City of Baltimore, for example, where the lack of access to treatment facilities is a real contributor to other problems in the community, from violence to crime to lack of economic opportunity. Third piece, importantly, we know that when parents have access to health care, their kids actually are more likely to take advantage of health care. And so this work to try to make sure that adults have their health care needs met isn't just about the adults, it is also about the kids. And I think about the work that California has beginning to embark on to make sure that folks who are undocumented also have access to health care. It is in our long-term interest to make sure that everyone in our community has access to quality care to address addiction, but also to address other health needs. Other questions? All right, I'm going to start cold calling. Stan, I know you have a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the connection between what goes on in the schools, specifically with the not-for-profit community in those neighborhoods. Because I think what a lot of people think is that these services are provided by government, but they're not. They're provided under contract with not-for-profit organizations, and not every district brings those organizations into the school to create that kind of a seamless connection between the NGO community and the school community. So are there specific things that you think could be done differently that would make the coordination between the not-for-profit community and the school community more effective?
Is this me? Okay. I can only speak to what we're doing in our community, but we have amazing collaboration with our nonprofit and our faith community. Partly because Fairfax County does a really wonderful job of bringing us all together and giving us opportunities to get to know each other, to find out what everybody does and what the needs are, and then accessing assistance and doing joint projects has become just part of our daily work, honestly. I don't think a week goes by where we don't have either a meeting or a conversation with 5 of our nonprofit partners, either to help a family, or they're calling us for information, or we're just trying to navigate to set up a new process to assist families, looking at gaps. You know, where do we have gaps funding-wise? Where do they have opportunities funding-wise? We have private citizens that have called us regularly to say, how can we help homeless kids in the school system? And so FCPS has set up a foundation, and they can make a donation to the foundation, and we can use that money for discretionary things that kids need, like an air mattress to sleep on because they're on someone's floor. Very specific, tangible resources that these kids need that's really from our partners outside of the educational world that are working to help us with kids.
And I would just say that I think when the issue of homelessness is raised, whether it's inside the school system or outside of the school system, that then can lead to a conversation about collaboration. But if the school system doesn't see that there are students who are experiencing homelessness, the liaison doesn't have the time or capacity to do the training, it becomes an issue that whether you can't engage the nonprofit because they don't even know it's there. But we've also seen the reverse, where the school system says, hey, we have 100 youth who are experiencing homelessness. We have nowhere for them to go. We need the community to take action. We need our nonprofit partners, and so they identify it as a pressing issue. So I think part of it is just somebody, whether it's inside or outside the school system, raising the issue of family and youth homelessness and seeing schools as a critical part of the solution, not just as a referral system, but as part of the answer to get out of homelessness.
Barbara, can I ask you to just build on that a little bit? There's often a challenge in effective communication between the school district, nonprofit providers, local government. What are some bright spots you're seeing around effective cross-sector communication?
Well, we've seen, for example, both in our early childhood work and also in the secondary level with youth who are experiencing homelessness, when there is some sort of, it could be an existing body, for example, it could be already a task force on graduation or an existing initiative on early childhood, and somebody then raises the issue of homelessness within that. So in other words, you don't need to create a new task force, one more meeting to go to, but making sure that the issue of homelessness is embedded to something that's already focusing on the issue. So maybe, for example, a school is looking at suicide prevention or bullying, and they already have an existing initiative to then be able to insert homelessness into it and be like, look, we have youth risk behavior survey data that shows that students who are homeless are way more likely to not just plan a suicide, but to attempt a suicide. Homelessness is an issue there. So I think those bright spots are around those collaborations. I'll take Eugene, Oregon, just to give a specific example, where they've identified the lack of housing for young people who are in high school and are really focused on a host home model. Host homes aren't the answer for every young person who's experiencing homelessness, so I don't want to say that, but they identified that, and then the faith community came in, and they've got a whole initiative going around that so that young people have some stability to get through high school.
We have a question here.
Mike Usdan, retired, but old enough to remember the debate in 1979 when the Department of Ed was created, where most of us in education were very supportive in terms of education deserving its own cabinet status and prestige. Al Shanker and a handful of other people back in 1979 opposed it on the grounds that it separated the E, education, from health and welfare, because it used to be the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And I'm just wondering, in light of the profound demographic changes, the needs of kids and families, and an increasingly diverse society, whether we have to rethink at every level in the governance structures, the institutional isolation of schools from general purpose government, which John alluded to. In Fairfax, for example, what's the relationship between the school system and general purpose government? Because these are the institutions that basically house the social service, the health system, and so forth. And this governance issue, I think, is very, very, very seminal here. Love your reactions.
Yeah. Kathy, you want to talk about Fairfax?
Well, I can speak a little bit about, I'm kind of a small role in that whole effort, but our community as a whole is very committed to healthy families, and that includes everything that families need to be healthy, including education and health and all the services, housing, everything, jobs, all the things that kids and families need to be healthy families. So I think communities are moving in that direction, at least ours is. And although it's a little bit of an effort in the beginning to kind of create, as you were saying, task force and whatever kind of group you want to get going, starting to do that and build relationships across all these different agencies, I think is the answer for our homeless families to get the services they need in a way that makes sense for them and helps us to be able to more efficiently get them what they need.
I think one hopeful example is the Interagency Council on Homelessness, which has made tremendous progress here in DC, representing all the federal agencies on veterans homelessness, which I think is an indicator of what happens when you have strong political will and effective cross-agency collaboration. So at the interagency table, you had Health and Human Services and the Education Department and Veterans Affairs. You had the Housing and Urban Development. So you had probably 10 plus agencies all gathered, all committed to this goal of eliminating veterans homelessness. And then you had mayors stepping up and committing that in their city they would end veterans homelessness. So you had collaboration at both the city level and at the federal level, and really a galvanizing of federal resources around eliminating veterans homelessness, and cities that were able to get to essentially functional zero homelessness amongst their veterans. Now, of course, part of that is that there's a voucher for veteran housing, which also is a reflection of Congress's commitment and political will. And I think the question for the country is, do we have similar political will around children and families? And could we make the same kind of commitment around children and families?
Well, I think, again, sorry, Elaine.
Yeah, so I would say one way that our community in Richmond is doing it is by building the coalition. So really going off what Kathy was saying, and that coalition has been convened by the United Way of Greater Richmond region, Greater Richmond and Petersburg, and to having their political, I would say, pull and being able to have their feet in many spaces, they were able to bring diverse voices to the table to have this discussion. And also everyone has a desire to end youth homelessness and housing instability in our community. So it was really, how do we convene everyone at the table and give everyone, having everyone speak the same language around this issue and see what are the self-interests from these different organizations to create change around this issue. And so that's the way we've done. I believe that, I think we do have to deconstruct the system to really build it up so that it can actually benefit young people experiencing and families experiencing homelessness. But a way that we've done is by building a coalition and working with partners who's doing work around youth homelessness in our community.
And I'll just say one big challenge to interagency collaboration, frankly, is the definition of homelessness. The housing system does not see the situations that Elaine experienced, that 80% of our young people in high schools as experiencing homelessness. So how do you get around a table and energize when they see only like less than 20% as actually being vulnerable, as actually being experiencing homelessness? Or if the answer is always housing, and we see in the school system, families have housing, they lose it. They have housing, they lose it. They have housing, they lose it. So we're not doing enough. So part of breaking down barriers to interagency collaboration is having an aligned definition of homelessness that recognizes that for children, youth, and families, it looks different. They're every bit as vulnerable, and that needs to be one big change we have in order to facilitate meaningful collective impact on the issue of child, youth, and family homelessness.
So we are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask each panelist to share a final word, a recommendation for this audience. I mean, we've got folks here from community-based organizations that are doing work on the ground, to policymakers, to folks who are going to go back to a congressional office and be able to tell a member of Congress what they should be thinking about on this issue. So what advice do you have for this room? What call to action do you have for them? So we'll start with Barbara and we'll work our way down so that Elaine closes us out.
All right, now I see the method to the madness, and I agree with that. Again, I think I would say in any attempt to address a complex problem, you have to see it first, and you have to see it for what it is. So we have the issue of homelessness, which is a marker for many, many, many other vulnerabilities. And yet by focusing in on those young people who are experiencing that extreme vulnerability, we can make changes in much more, we can make bigger changes. So for example, in any debate, what we're having around, for example, the Higher Education Act in Congress, to focus on the experiences of students who are homeless and removing barriers will help many, many other children and youth. So the global changes that we make to help all students, we can improve by focusing on the experiences of children and youth who are homeless and what they need and to remove those barriers.
And I would say get involved. It's so easy. Anybody can call any school district's homeless liaison and say, I want to help homeless kids. And they will have a list of things that you can do, from small projects to big projects to anything that suits your mission. And it's a very simple thing to do to get involved in helping schools with homeless kids.
I would say, so two things. One is educate yourself on the issue. And I would say really reframing the way we think about youth, family, homelessness, and really thinking about them as individuals first and not just their circumstances, and seeing them the same way you will see yourself and your children, your family, as well as finding ways to advocate. If there's any bills, if there are any policy changes in your community that you can advocate for that push towards ending youth and family homelessness, do that, as well as invest in young people and see them as the future, and they will see themselves as that, and create spaces where their voice is being centered. It's not enough to just have young people at the table if they're not a part of making decisions. And so as we make decisions that impacts their lives, making sure their voice is at the table and that they're being empowered to create change in their community as well.
Perfect note to end on. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Thanks so much, John. What a wonderful panel. Thank you, John, Barbara, Elaine, and Kathy. I'd also like to shout out Patricia Julianelle, who's with Schoolhouse Connection, and a total force in the great work on this Education Leads Home campaign. Another thing you can do that's very practical is go on the website and look at the Education Leads Home campaign, and you can get involved in the collective effort. So we're going to have one more panel, closing set of remarks, and then you'll be dismissed for summer vacation, so hang in there with us. It's my pleasure now to introduce really a strong partner of this whole effort in public media, William Branham. He's a correspondent and producer with the PBS NewsHour in Washington, D.C. The breadth and reach of his coverage is stunning and always seems to be award-winning. From America's opioid crisis to integration of women in combat roles in the Marine Corps to the Syrian refugee crisis to a 6-part series on the global HIV/AIDS crisis to climate change in the Antarctic, where he spent 3 weeks. As importantly, he helps us eat delicious food by covering the Barefoot Contessa and how we can all enjoy the delights of, culinary delights. He's also worked with the New York Times, ABC News, National Geographic, Frontline, now with Bill Moyers, and was an adjunct professor at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. There must be three of him. Please welcome William Branham.
Thank you all very much for having me here. And I should say, that's a very lovely introduction. I only sporadically cover education policy, so I bring something of a rookie's understanding of the complexities and the challenges. Of course, I see the troubles that people have all over the country in my reporting, holding down jobs, supporting their families, making it through college, getting out from under the burden of student debt. So in some ways, I see the echoes of the failures of education policy all over the place. And then I also see the successes of it. I've spent many times with families of first-generation people who have gone through and been the first in their family to graduate from high school, to graduate from college, the first person who's able to have a full-time job and get health insurance because of that job and keep their home because of that. So I do appreciate the salience and the importance of getting all of this right. So I'd like to just introduce the three people who are coming up here. Our first, Stanley Littell, I would like to welcome you up. He is a professor at Columbia and Duke University, and he is an innovator in residence at Duke, President Emeritus of the IBM Foundation. Stan, thank you for being here. And Deborah Delisle is here as well. She is the president of the Alliance for Excellence and Excellent Education. Sorry. And she has worn many, many hats over the course of her career, working in federal education policy, in local education policy in Ohio, and has a great perspective that we're looking forward to as well.
Thank you so much.
And Bob Balthans as well, who you all heard from earlier today. Bob is the director of the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you all very, very much for being here. As I mentioned, this is a trio. This is a powerhouse of information, of the stuff that works and the stuff that doesn't work in educational policy. So I'm going to do as much as I can to stay out of their way and let us instruct us about what is working and what is not working. Bob, I would like to start with you first. It's something that you touched on earlier, and it's something you touched on in your Washington Post op-ed, which I would recommend everyone reads if you hadn't from yesterday. It really touches on what to my mind really does seem like a lot of very, very good news in this report, and there is a lot of that. But the skeptics and the critics remain, that somehow these rising graduation numbers that we see across the country are somehow the function partly of schools watering down standards and simply cycling people through and giving them a diploma that's really not meaningful. You touched on this a little bit. Yep. Can you tackle this issue?
Yeah, so I think we're confounding two issues. The one question we ask ourselves is, does a high school diploma equal college readiness? And the absolute answer to that is no. It currently does not for all students. But we shouldn't be sort of shocked or, I think, greatly upset by that, because one, we're heading in the right direction. I would say the data shows more and more kids are getting a diploma and then leaving high school college ready. But we have to remember that the Great American High School, which drove this nation to greatness in the 20th century, was designed with the idea that most people, high school would be the end point. And with the shifts in the economy in the 21st century, the high school now has to be the jumping off point for everybody to post-secondary schooling and training. That's a huge social and institutional shift. And society and institutions don't change in 5 years. So I really think it's actually the work of the next 20 years to make sure that every single diploma, every single student leaves high school ready for post-secondary something. And I would say the good news is, I think from our reports, we're heading in the right direction. We're making progress. But there's still a long way to go. I mean, the data probably says we're talking about 50, 60% of kids, however you want to cut it, where you could say they're college ready when they leave high school. That equates about to the percent of kids that are succeeding in college right now. So the work is to get everybody up to that. And then I think where we sort of, conflate things is to say, well, because that's true, then getting a diploma and not being college ready means the diploma isn't worth anything. And that's where I think we forget, it's really much better to be a high school graduate than not. We just heard about your odds of being homeless, your odds of being healthy, your odds of staying out of jail. So many social and health and other issues are much better with a high school degree than not, that there is value in that. And secondly, you know, we have to remind ourselves, if you got a high school diploma before 1984, you graduated at a time when you had higher requirements for phys ed than math. So does that mean your diploma isn't worth much now because you were not required to take a lot of math to get your high school degree? The term gentleman's C was created for sort of wealthy guys that goofed off in high school. And we didn't want to...
whom ended up as president.
Absolutely. And we didn't want to prevent their ascendance through the power structure. So we would give them a gentleman's C. So I think this idea that suddenly we've watered down high school diplomas to increase the rate doesn't really capture the history of it, or the understanding that graduating college ready is the goal and the challenge and the work of the next 20 years of making progress. The fact that we're not there yet doesn't mean getting a high school diploma doesn't mean anything.
Deb, I can see both you and Stan want to pick up on this idea, but this is obviously the central question that we're talking about, which is, what does it mean when you put on that cap and gown? Just take up this idea of how crucial this is, what we know about what that diploma means for a young person today.
Sure, thanks. So to build on that, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And one of the big facets we need right here, areas of focus, is what does that high school diploma mean? And without making a political statement too much here, you know, I know we are the United States of America, but one of the fallacies I see in that phrasing is that we are not united across what it means to graduate from high school and to be prepared for post-secondary education. And the sad part is we know that about 80% of jobs, future jobs and current jobs, require some type of post-secondary education. And more than half of those within that 80% are actually now requiring more than a bachelor's degree. So it's more important ever for the future of our country that we start to look at what is it that high school diploma actually means, and is it a certificate to actually do something that's employable to earn a very productive wage, right? So we know that there are more than, I think states have more than combined 100 pathways to a high school diploma. All of those are not equal. So again, we're not united in what we want for the future of our country through education, and we have to be sure that those pathways are actually aligned, whatever pathway you take to get a high school diploma, that they're all aligned with college and career ready standards. And I was reading a research report recently that's suggesting that current 8th graders will change jobs, not professions, but jobs, actually our professions, almost 4 to 6 times in their careers, right? So you have to understand that kids have to have also the ability to analyze and problem solve and communicate and to be able to adapt to new situations. It's just not moving from a teacher to a principal. It's moving maybe from a teacher to I'm going to make an exaggeration, an airline pilot, right? So there are so many facets to this whole issue around high school diplomas that just really, really are critical for us. And also we have to be sure that all kids, all means really all, not just the underserved, but recognizing even kids who are near poverty. So we have to be sure that students have great success systems around them. I think you heard right from the prior panel that those are so essential, and high schools can't do it on their own.
Stan, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, sure. I think that the high school diploma does matter, and it's important that we have a goal that every student get a high school diploma. But it's also true that students with high school diplomas are often not college ready. And that reality, if you look at college registration versus college completion, you see, especially for low-income young people and young people of color, that they enroll, but they can't complete for a variety of different reasons. And one critical reason is lack of college readiness. So that's, the high school diploma is critical, college readiness is critical, college completion is critical, and it's particularly important that we understand the link between high school, college, and career. The discussion about changes in the workplace are critically important. It's not only that young people will go from 1 job to 4 jobs over their career, but their jobs are changing. And the demands of an individual job are changing. And the need for ongoing learning and adaptation once you're in the workplace is critically important. So I think the report that we're discussing today is critically important, that we start off with an understanding about why a high school diploma is critically important. But don't end the conversation there, because the next step is college ready, college completion, and the link between college and career. And all of it is particularly important. And as we sort of like look at how we're addressing these issues, we can't do it in silos. You know, early in my career, I was the deputy chancellor of schools in New York City. I was in it from the K to 12 standpoint. And then I moved into the private sector in charge of corporate affairs for the IBM company, a company with 370,000 employees. And work in companies like IBM and all companies and the private sector overall is radically changing, and the pace of change is picking up. And now I serve as a trustee of the State University of New York, and we have hundreds of thousands of students in the SUNY system statewide who come to us from school districts around New York and elsewhere who are just not college ready. And we can't approach these things in silos. We need to find a way to connect all of these systems together, because everyone has an interest in solving this problem, and we can't do it by pointing the finger at somebody else. We've got to do it by creating an opportunity for us to work collectively to solve this problem. So as we heard about the discussion in homeless, that problem is not just the problem of educators. Mm-hmm. That's the problem of government, large communities, and the private sector too. And then when we talk about, you know, making our students college ready, that's also not just a problem to be solved in the high schools. They need help from government. They need help from the private sector. So I think the report is critically important. Let's not focus in on, well, is it true that the high school diploma is as high quality as we want it to be? It's a good first step. It's not the only step. And let's focus in on closing the connection between high school, college, and career.
Can I just add one thing to that? Because something you brought up is just really so critical in this, and that's the remediation reality that we're facing when kids go in. And so many people just really believe that.
Can you clarify what you mean by remediation?
So kids going into college who have to take remediation coursework, right? And it's twice as, the percentages are twice as high for kids of color and kids in poverty going into that. So that says something right there about the preparedness of students going from that. And I think we give this false sense of hope, like, oh, I got this certificate, this piece of paper with some seal on it, and now I can go to a community college or a four-year institution. But in addition to that, we are racking up a tremendous amount of student debt. I think it's at $1.5 trillion now. I am really afraid for the future of our country from an economic standpoint. When we think back to the housing crisis, this is a national crisis of just unknown proportions that's going to have. And so even when those kids are facing, even if they do graduate from a four-year institution and find a job, the ability of those folks to repay that student debt is just phenomenal. I mean, all of us probably have relatives who are facing, I see kids coming out $75,000, $125,000 worth of debt, $150,000, and they're getting a $35,000 a year job. They're moving back home with mom and dad or grandma, grandpa, aunties, right? That is a huge issue for our country. So we have to eliminate that as well and really focus on getting kids well prepared and having that diploma mean something when they enter into it. I'm sure you see that all the time in the SUNY system.
We see it, and the point about what we're spending on remediation, what is about $2.7 billion a year on remediation, where students are not getting any credit for the courses. That resource is being poorly spent. Mm-hmm. Apart from the fact that we shouldn't wind up with a system where 80 to 90% of students coming into a community college system who are low income have to take remedial courses. But the remedial courses are not accomplishing what we would like them to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And it would be so much better if we took that investment and we invested it in more of the college readiness that we think is critically important.
Bob, you touched on this in your opening comments about what the evidence indicates are the metrics by which we could look at whether a diploma was meaningful for a student's ability to do well in college. What are those? Can you touch on that evidence again?
Yep. And
also talk a little bit about what schools need to be doing better to try to make that a smoother transition.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that we did this. There's been a paucity of longitudinal data that connects high schools to college outcomes. And that's one thing that stood in our way of getting a better understanding of what do kids actually need in high school to be ready for college. A lot of it has been guesswork. Like, yes, they need strong academic skills, but is that necessarily enough, right? We don't, so we're starting now to get more longitudinal data sets online, and we recently looked at one at Boston, and that's where it showed us that, to get an 80% of kids from Boston who got a high school degree who in high school, at least came 95% of the time, which means, that's decent attendance. It's not actually fantastic. You could still miss 2 weeks a year and get it 95%. Who had a GPA of at least 2.7, which means more B's than C's. It doesn't even mean like an A average. But crucially, took challenging classes. So they took the sequence of courses you needed to take to be admitted to the Massachusetts State University system, which is like the 4 math, the 3 science, the 2 foreign language, and at least took an AP class, which exposed them at least to college level work. So it wasn't such a shock from like high school to college. Kids that did all 4 of those, 80% earned BAs. It was very striking. Kids that did none of them, only 10% got BAs. And 40% of the high school graduates of the Boston class had none of those indicators. So again, that's your gap, that 40% of the graduates were really graduating with only a 10% chance of odds of actually earning a BA, because they hadn't had that experience of basically being able to succeed in challenging classes, because that's what you have to do in college, right? I mean, what's interesting, the process to graduate high school and graduate college is the same. You've got to take your class. It's got to be the right class that leads to the set of classes you need to take to get a degree, and you got to pass the classes. If you do that, you will get a degree, right? Same high school and college. It's interesting. It's not as different as people think. But the challenge, our work that remains, is for that group of kids that are both graduating but have not had those experiences, and the kids that are still not graduating. And you put that together, that's like 40% of kids. It's not a small number. And I think the challenge we have to think is that a shorthand for this is the data sort of says, like, almost the most obvious statement in the world, like, you have to be decent at school to be able to keep going to school and do okay. Like, you can't just sort of like not do well and suddenly just pick it up in college. Like, I could just like do nothing and then I'll show up and I'll be great, right? But if we need that for all kids, that means then schools have got to be good for kids also. It's got to like work both ways. Like, we can't just say be good at school no matter how bad it is for you, right? Because there's another very interesting group of kids, right, who don't like school, get C's and D's, they pass, they really want to work, their families have strong work ethics, it's been a tradition forever, you work defines your life. And unfortunately, what they find in the current labor market is after they've tried that for a couple of years, they're making $13,000 a year working part-time, and they recognize there's no future. They try to go back to school, but they've been out for a while, they didn't like school to start with, they get all the debt to go back, and they don't succeed. So I agree, we have to figure out that solution for that 40% of kids so that many more leave high school ready for a post-secondary option. But it's going to be a little more work than just saying raise standards and they'll all raise to it, because we have to make sure school is good for everybody, including like the homeless kids and other kids that face real adversity. We need to build the support so it goes both ways.
Bob is obviously talking about a lot of both the societal factors that affect who those children are and the world they're going to be leaving once they go out of school, but also an incredible challenge that high schools have to take on to teach these kids and to bring all of those children with all of those varied challenges along so that they are ready. What do you see as the key factors? Are high schools across the board, is the evidence there? Are there programs where schools can do this? Is this too much of a lift that we're asking? Or is this something that you really do believe that the vast majority of schools can do?
So I want to say yes, but it's taking a rethinking of the pedagogy around how students learn and what the role of the educators are, and actually all adults in a kid's life, right? So, as an assistant secretary of education, I had a wonderful opportunity to visit thousands of schools across the country. And what I found were just amazing places where just incredible things were going on with kids every single day. And I have to say, in all of the years, even as a superintendent and principal, I never saw a teacher walk into a school and say one day, you know what, I'm going to mess up this kid's life today. Most often, their bag of tricks, that's a sort of a euphemism, is just kind of empty, right? So we don't always feed the souls and hearts and minds of teachers and principals to understand what is it that I need to do to reach certain students? How do I have to build relationships with students? And with the ever-pressing, looming question around assessments, which probably is a whole different panel, but this focus on I got to get the test scores for my kids, so I got to get through the whole book on geometry by the end of the year. The reality is that in the schools where incredible things are working with kids, relationships matters. I think you heard from the student today. Building a relationships matters more than even what academic pages they're getting through within a certain year. Because when kids know that you respect them and you understand them as human beings, not as a collective number, they will do a lot of things for you because they just want to learn and they want to achieve at high levels. So I think we have to do a better job of lifting up the great stories. Now, maybe reporters, and perhaps not you, I've not read all of your things, but maybe reporters don't think it's sexy to report on the really great things that are happening in schools, particularly with students who are historically or traditionally underserved. But again, if we lift up those stories, we can give hope to other schools to do it. And I was in the UK one time, and they had this incredible program where high-achieving schools would be matched with lower-achieving schools. And the principals could interchange, and teachers would go back and forth. And the high-achieving school actually received a lot of incentives to co-share instructional materials and instructional practices. That just demonstrated a willingness on the part of that government to lift up schools to help one another. Because too often we write blue ribbon reports and another white paper and we believe that's going to happen. I just say, we know what to do. But let's make sure that we can establish partnerships from one effective school to another, from an underperforming school to a highly effective school, and create partnerships and lift up the story of where things are really good and happening in the lives of kids.
Stan, at the beginning of this, Bridge mentioned how you were rocking the educational community with some of the work you've been doing, particularly the P-TECH program. Could you talk a little bit about what that is, what it does, and why you see its centrality?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that, first of all, as we talk about high school, some of us really don't remember the fact that high school wasn't mandatory in the States and the United States until after the Second World War. Before that, in America, high school was an option. K-8 was your education system, and you had a choice. If you chose to go to high school, it was an option. And a variety of different states, some of them earlier on and some of them later on, made high school mandatory. But as we've heard, high school is not enough. So if you look at the data, and I like the report that Bridge and the company did on saying, let's look at the data demonstrates that the jobs require post-secondary degrees and increasingly require skills. Some of them refer to them as soft skills. I prefer to refer to them as essential skills. Absolutely. Because they are critically important. And then the high school diploma is not enough, obviously, and the job has changed. So in 2010, when I was working at the IBM company, we collaborated and partnered with the City of New York to create a grade 9 through 14 school called P-TECH, Pathways to Technology, Early College, High School. And the idea was to create a seamless, coordinated 9 through 14 program where you had a scope and sequence where you connect your high school courses to your college courses. Don't say do well in high school, you'll do well in college, but connect the courses through a scope and sequence. And also make sure that as the strong academic curriculum is being taught, make sure that you're not changing the curriculum, but reinforce writing skills, presentation skills, problem-solving skills in the way in which the curriculum is taught by giving teachers the opportunity to have access to high-quality project-based learning and using that to be able to stress the importance of education being connected to college and career. And then have a partner from the private sector agree to provide mentors for every student, and that's not helping with homework, but that's trained mentors who can assist the student by being able to help them to be able to not just do their academic work, but understand how their work is connected to career. provide high-quality paid internships, and make a commitment that students who successfully complete, meaning an AAS degree in an important connected degree program, they have a commitment to be first in line for jobs. So the first school opened in the fall of 2011, and that school now is in year 8, and their college completion rates are 500% higher than the national average. So African American girls who start the program within 6 years, over 80% get their AAS degree in 6 years or less, many in 3.5 to 4 years. And they wind up getting hired by a company with starting salaries at about $56,000 a year. And virtually all of the hires have been promoted, and virtually all of them going on to complete their bachelor's degrees. And the dropout rate is about 0, right? So is it an effective model? Because now there are about 100 such schools in the United States, and now 8 countries outside the United States following the model. And by the fall, there'll be over 200 such schools. So I think that's an effective model. I think it employs, it gets the employer to the table. The old model of apprenticeship, you know, doesn't work any longer. And this is apprenticeship 2.0, because it's really preparing people for the workplace, but understanding that college really matters and the skills taught in college really matter. So it is, I think, a model that's effective. It helped lead to a change in federal policy through Perkins Act, which was reauthorized along those kinds of models to link to labor market data and to make sure that there was a focus on experiential education and a connection between high school and college and career. But it's not nearly enough, because 200 schools at full capacity will wind up serving over 100,000 young people. But if you look at the numbers, that's not nearly enough. So I think what we need to do is we need to look at models like that that are successful, and don't say we've done our job when we have 100 or 200 schools. That's the model for fixing American education. And it's also important that you get all the key players at the table. I don't think that there are a lot of discussion lately from people in the private sector saying college doesn't matter and you just need a credential. I would like to know if they say that to their own children. College doesn't matter, because college does matter. And the idea that a credential over a small amount of time connected to one job that might not exist over 3 to 5 years, that's not the solution. There could be micro-credentials, that's fine, but the large-scale solution, I think, contained in this report is to come up with the models that actually are going to get more kids a college degree and make sure that they are career-ready. And that's what P-TECH is about.
Deb, you sat right at the intersection of this, both as your work in Ohio and at the federal government. Obviously, how difficult is it to wield the levers of the federal government to incentivize this kind of a program? I mean, we saw this recently.
Sorry.
We can shut the cameras off.
Okay.
I mean, we saw this with the different states trying to lure Amazon, and
Sure.
Virginia is recently now going to be hosting a new campus here, and they're apparently opening up schools that will try to train more students who might be ready for those types of jobs. Mm-hmm. But how difficult is that, or is it not so difficult for the federal government to use its levers to do this kind of thing?
I think that there are sort of two sides to this, and I see it from both sides of having been at the local level and then at the state and the federal government. And I'll say rather jokingly, tongue-in-cheek, you know, I was at the local level, I would always think, so I was in Ohio, and as a superintendent, I'd say, like, what are those people in Columbus thinking anyway, right? Because they were regulating the state government. Then I got down to Columbus, and the superintendent's probably said to me, what's she thinking? But then I was like, well, what is that federal office thinking? Then I got to the federal office, I was not knowing who to blame, so I was like, I don't know what the White House is thinking. Like, I don't, you know, I didn't know who else to go for it. So there is this genuine gap that exists among and between all kinds of agencies. And sitting between two higher ed folks, so I'm going to exclude them from this. The K through 12 system, generally speaking, does not talk to the higher ed folks, and the higher ed folks in turn do not talk to K-12, right? So you have this big gap even with teacher training institutions, which just have to be changed. Teacher training programs, principal training, those have to be changed.
And whose responsibility is that?
I think it's both sides of the issue. We have to stop doing this kind of thing and saying, whose responsibility is it? Like, so let me give you a really good example of that. When I was a superintendent right outside of Cleveland, there were, I can't remember, about 15 school districts adjacent to the city of Cleveland. And so we came together often as a consortium because we basically had students coming back and forth across our district lines. So we knew we had to do things together as opposed to being competitive with who our students were and what our scores were. But we got together also to push on teacher prep programs and basically say, this is what our kids need, especially on the east side, which was a very diverse population. So we can go to those general feeder schools that came into us. We had 51 teacher training programs in Ohio. They were all not of equal quality, unfortunately, right? But because then when I got to the State Department, I could see that we worked very hard with the Board of Regents in Ohio to bring our groups together and talk about that. In fact, Senator Sherrod Brown brought us all together at one particular point. So there has to be people who serve as catalysts. Is it complex? Absolutely. Is it impossible? Absolutely not. And I do think that there's a great way to have synergy around and getting to the point in every single state, what do you want for a graduate at graduation? So I just call them a grad at grad statements, right? So if you're in New York, you're going to have all of these systems coming together and saying, this is what we want our kids to be, if they can think analytically and respond to productivity, et cetera. But you have to come together and you just have to make it happen. So is it impossible? No. It feels that way sometimes. And I do think that relationships, even, we talk about relationships from adults to kids in school systems. Relationships among adults matters a lot. And we've got to stop with the competition and feeling like, what is it that you can do? Are you going to get more credit, Bob, or am I going to get more credit for this? We have to say, the young kids, the youth is our future. And I was at America's Promise big event this weekend in California, and there were 200 youth there. I call them kids, but they were like, there was a 12-year-old on stage who was actually emceeing the whole program. And I kept thinking, like, what was I doing at 12 years old? I didn't have stage, I don't know I have stage presence now, but certainly not at 12. But these were kids with incredible odds they were facing. And now, just like the individual, I'm sorry, I forgot her name this morning, was talking, they're giving back to their community. One foster kid I sat near working 65 hours a week and working full time. And I was like, who's feeding your soul? And then she's still working on legislation for foster youth, right? That person needs us as adults to come together. And I would say one other thing, and that is, I've always lived the mantra that what you offer to kids tells them what it is that you value. And unless we provide support structures and model for them that we as adults in whatever organization and systems we're living in, federal, state, local, nonprofits, that we're willing to reach and come together at a round table, then we need actually to come together and do that and model to them that this can be done. And perhaps siding a little bit on the political here, it's almost becoming more impossible to do that in this current state.
You were all touching on so many of these central policy issues, but one thing I'd like to go back to, Bob, that you had mentioned earlier, which was the chasm, the inequality that you were describing earlier about these schools that are graduating 90% of their students, and then these other minority of schools that are not even graduating half of their students. Is there a way to summarize your sense of what the data indicate that why is that occurring? What is going on in those particular schools?
Yeah. So it's sort of maybe a triple hit, which is that we've, as a rule, sort of congregate our highest needs kids in a subset of schools not designed for that level of need, and that's hundreds of years of sort of racial and economic segregation and bad policies, right?
So children with the greatest sets of needs being put into the schools with the least ability to serve those needs.
And in high concentrations. And so what's happening, the schools that are really struggling are, and sometimes very tragically, they're in single high school towns, because that's how high schools spread. Every town built their high school. It became the centerpiece of the town. It became everyone went to that school together. It became the thing that glued them together. But when that town lost in the battle of the change of the economy, and was the town that was made a part in the third level of the supply chain that went away, basically the town is struggling, the school is struggling, and the district is struggling. and everybody has high needs, including the parents. And in that case, there's just the resources are not there because people still generally get most of their money for schooling locally. And if everybody is in that kind of stress, it's very hard to for them to organically work their way out of it. And that's why it's really important that we identify those places and give them the level of supports needed from both the state and the feds and nonprofit, just so they can basically have a fighting chance to create a new pipeline to adult success.
Can I add one piece to that? Because I get really concerned when we're talking in this issue around, as I'm sure my colleagues do as well, because we very often will focus on urban centers and where resources are available. And we have close to 30% of America's kids in our rural and isolated regions. And those are kids and families who don't have the resources available to them. So remember when I was at the Department of Ed, and we were talking about a competitive grant policy, and we were going to place a priority on rural students. So if you wrote to that, you got extra points is really what it was all about. And there was a requirement for kids to have a paid internship and mentorship. And I thought to myself, in Ohio, if you go to the southeastern corner of the state in Appalachia, you're going to find some of the poorest communities in America, right? Very poor white and black families. And I remember thinking, what mentorships and internships are possibly available in southeastern Ohio? There's a Walmart 45 minutes away. I don't know, you get mentorships there that we want for our kids. I'm not putting down Walmart, but it's not the... it's the not professional roles.
It's not a
you
growth
want.
industry.
Exactly.
For
Thank you.
Living
wages.
wages.
You were far more tactful than I was going to be. There was a prison nearby. So where were these? And the plight of America's kids in those families is horrible in terms of their future hope. I mean, if anybody's read Hillbilly Highway, you get a good sense of that trajectory for those kids. And so even whether kids are homeless in foster care, even the resources available for them for medical care and health-related issues is just huge. So I'm going to make a big plea for that. We don't forget those kids who are in rural and isolated regions and believe that we just have to access resources in our community to help them and create this big, robust system of support.
Yeah, I would just say I visited the P-Tech school up by the Canadian border in a very, very rural area. And there are 9 small companies that are the collaborators and partners providing the paid internships. And we had a conference, and all the employers were there, and all the districts were there. And one of the employers got up and said, the students who he had doing his internship actually presented the PowerPoint demonstration that he did to get a $1.5 million contract with another company. And the recruitment rates in terms of jobs for those young people in rural areas are good. I think you can't just imagine it. You've got to have a structure. You've got to have the training and the support to be able to make sure that happens. But I think that, when we talk about what is the challenge, I think we really need to get the employer community much more engaged and much more involved. And I think you brought up the example of Amazon opening in Maryland, but Amazon is not opening in New York. And why did a city and a state like New York City and New York State organize against bringing a company that was promising 25 to 40,000 jobs into that community? And I think a lot of it had to do with a sense that they weren't committed to the community, and they hadn't made a commitment to workers, and they hadn't made a commitment to education. And perhaps if they had, we might have had Amazon not only in Maryland, but they might have been, in New York as well. And I think we need to set a higher bar for the private sector to become more engaged in these kinds of activities. And when we think about what role government could play in doing that, when we look historically about the behavior of government vis-a-vis the for-profit community, it's been about regulating the worst behavior, which is a good thing because you don't want them to behave badly. But what about incenting the best behavior? What about government thinking about raising the bar significantly? And if the private sector changed their hiring practices and hired more young people of color, maybe that would be something that should be recognized and an incentive, and maybe that would change the dynamic a little bit. You know, when we talk about like schools that are not working or young people who nobody think could be successful, it reminds me of a young man who went to the P-Tech school in Brooklyn, Oscar Tadilla. In grade 8, Oscar was 2 years behind, and it was an open enrollment school, no exam to get in, no creaming. But Oscar started the 9th grade, and he thought, well, maybe he could finish high school. His mother was an immigrant from Mexico. Maybe he could finish high school. And given the support and given the kinds of things that I talked about that are the network that's provided through P-Tech, he completed his high school diploma and his associate's degree in computer science in 3.5 years. And he got a full scholarship to Cornell. And Oscar is going to be a very, very successful young man, and he's going to mentor other students as he succeeds in his career. And that is an opportunity for all young people. He's not unique. That is an opportunity for all young people. And I think that, you know, for a company like IBM to hire out of that one school, you know, 36 young people, all of them children of color, I think enriches the company, and it provides a benefit overall. So I think that the assumptions about who can be successful and which schools are going to be successful that lead us into, you know, creaming the population and saying you've got to have an exam to get in and you can only provide these opportunities to some students gets blown away if you really do provide the support that young people really need, because they can be successful.
You know, it's interesting. I was just thinking of this as it popped in my head as you were talking, and that is, you know, and it really relates to the earlier question around, is it impossible? It's not impossible when people open themselves up. So can the business community actually step into the school, in the district, and say, like, we're willing to be partners. Here's what we can offer to you, as opposed to always waiting for somebody from a school district to say, here's what we need. Because sometimes the district doesn't necessarily know what a nonprofit says. So I was thinking of Amazon going into, it's actually going into Virginia. And both school systems, Arlington and Alexandria, are really struggling. I think they're really struggling from comments that I've heard around what do you do with this influx of kids coming in. And imagine if Amazon was demanded to actually...
You mean the children of
the
new
children
employees?
Of new employees, yeah, because the populations are bursting, right? And Alexandria has very few opportunities, but they have a continuing growing student population. Where do you build new schools? Where does the money come from? And where do you find all the teachers you want that are really exceptional for those kids, right? But what if Amazon also was committed to saying, if they go into a community, we're going to provide X number of mentorships and internships for college, for example, for kids, or for high school students to get them prepared for college, or we're going to put this amount of money into a foundation to create innovative schools within these 2 school districts and perhaps even into the DC area. That's like a mutual beneficial relationship.
And
not
you know,
just a tax break.
and you know, you pointed to the Bob and I on either side of you from higher education. Yeah. But if you sort of look at the higher education community, they invite in employers. That's the success of Silicon Valley, is inviting in the private sector into those institutions. So we have schools that are half occupied in cities like Chicago or Pittsburgh or Detroit and places like that. Has anybody thought about the opportunity that could be created if those vacant space were maker space, not just for companies like an Amazon, but for entrepreneurs and small businesses to be able to locate in exchange for mentoring, jobs for parents, and all kinds of other kinds of benefits that could be provided. But if we think about our systems in silos, we're never going to get to that point.
Totally.
We are near the end of our time here, so I'd like you all to think about any questions you would like for these three. This is a big repository of information up here, so squeeze them for all you can. Lastly, Bob, I would ask you, you are looking at this data in a very granular way, trying to understand the messages that are coming out of this and what applies to best practices that we can all employ. And I'm wondering if there's something that stands out to you, that if you were put in a position to deliver a singular piece of information or a single data point to a political leader, someone who could make a real difference, what is that fact that stands out to you the most, that you said, look, if you would take this on board and act accordingly, what is that and what would you like to see them do? And then we'll take questions.
Wow. Yeah. Oh.
love it when I can stump them.
I think it is that simple finding that it comes down to we want our kids to be able to do decent and challenging courses. So that's the idea that people need to be challenged in school, not just sort of do your time there, not just sort of punch the clock, and that people are capable of that. But we're gonna have to give some resourcing on both the relationship side, so that someone always knows there's a person there that cares about them and knows them. And we're gonna have to do some stuff on the teacher development side. And in particular, what I would argue is that this is one of the things that gets very lampooned because it hasn't had a lot of success, but it has, which is like teacher professional development. We put so much more. Most of the professions have so much more strong professional development, from the military to medicine, intensive, serious training cycles once you're in the profession. We don't have that in education. And but what we're saying at the same time is that we've got to radically change the goal of high schooling from the endpoint to most to the jumping off point for all. Means that teachers are going to have to teach very different than they were taught. And to do that, they're going to need serious professional growth opportunities. They're not going to be able to do that just comes out of nowhere, I can do it. And that's an area, partly because it has a bad reputation and partly because it's not very exciting sounding, that is not invested in at all. So I would, giving my time to think, pull it together, I would invest it in really good evidence-based ways to develop the professional growth of teachers, to enable them to learn how to teach all kids to be able to succeed in challenging classes.
That's great. Do we have any questions out here? Yes.
Hi, my name is Roxy Barnaby. I'm from the Philadelphia Youth Network in Philadelphia. We're a not-for-profit, and our mission is to alleviate poverty and inequity through education and employment. So everything that you're talking about here, those bridges, and strengthening those bridges and not letting the conversation stop at, continuing to increase the high school graduation rate. That's what we live and practice. So it was very exciting to hear all of that. But my question is for Stanley in particular. In Philadelphia, we do have many partnerships among the school district and the city, our child welfare system, our not-for-profit sector, to really tap into our private sector and build those partnerships and internships and really have them give back. But we're really looking to take that to the next level. So I'm wondering what maybe your top 2 to 3 recommendations for strategies to do that might be from your experience.
Yeah, I would say engaging with the private sector in a very, very concrete and collaborative way. And I think what we also have to understand is that people in the private sector are very concerned about this anti-business environment, right? They're not living in an island. They're reading it. It started out with, Wall Street as the cause of all ills in society and the cause of income inequality, the shredded, social safety net. And now it's shifting to Silicon Valley and maybe also moving toward middle America with people showing up at Walmart's, annual meeting. So this fervor, this anti-business fervor is growing. So I think it is a good opportunity to engage the private sector because they're very concerned. They're very concerned. And figuring out what to do, I think they can't do it on their own. They're going to need partnership and collaboration from the not-for-profit sector and also from government. And I think if government can reach out to the private sector to help you to develop those collaborations and partnerships, then you would have some, strength in being able to get to the private sector collaborators and partners. But I think, this is a scary time, with finger pointing at everyone, whether it's, R's and D's or all different sectors of the economy. But this is also an opportunity when people are concerned that their nervousness might bring them to the table and get them willing to do some different things. And I think, we don't have a lot of structured things in place that are cross-sector collaborative kinds of activities. So people are too much operating in those silos. And I think whether it's on a city level or a state level, we really need to bring people together to look at the data and then come up with the collaborative solutions as opposed to the finger pointing.
Anyone else? Okay, please join me in thanking these three for coming up here and sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you very, very much.
Both panels and our expert panelists. I think I've been blown away by the breadth of content that's been covered between the two panels, and have certainly got a lot more to act on and think about going forward. I was struck by this breadth that we've talked, a report that Civic has been doing for 10 years about graduation rate data is really causing a conversation about root causes. What's happening with young people, what's happening with the systems. So I think it's pretty remarkable and powerful that a report on data can reveal this level of rigorous debate and demands on the system. So I want to speak to just a couple things that I have been reflecting on. I was at the State of Young People that America's Promise hosted at Facebook last week, and I talked to a young woman and a young man who said to me, school isn't giving me what I need. What I need for what comes after high school graduation, I'm getting from my after-school programs, I'm getting from my family and my church community. I'm getting it in all these other places, but not school. And so I'm struck that graduating from high school isn't just an academic endeavor. When young people move on to what comes next, they're relying on a social network. We heard that pretty strongly from Elaine. They're relying on readiness through mentors and the private sector. They're trying to figure out what comes next. And the diversity of our student population right now demands us to all not just know the data, but to accept that not all young people are coming to school and to work with the same set of resources and skills. And so it's really the system's job to flip that and say, what can the system do to meet that diverse student population? And I want to say to Elaine, I heard you, that the system has to be broken down and reconstructed. And I would say we heard a lot of examples today of the system breaking down and reconstructing, maybe in small little cycles, but I have to believe that those small cycles of breaking down and reconstructing will amount to something. And I think the progress that Building a Grad Nation report this year has revealed is the progress is happening because we are breaking down the system and reconstructing it, in no small part due to the work of thousands of educators across the country and thousands of families and young people. So I say to all of us, I hope you can find your call to action from our panels today. I encourage everyone to share the report widely today. We've got it on the America's Promise website, and the hashtag is #GradNation. Please share it widely. This isn't just data, it's about young people. And so who are those young people? What do they need? And what's your role in making that happen? So I want to close again by saying thank you, and another round of applause for our panelists and speakers. And have a great summer. BGN is always the sign of summer.